Okay, we will finish in this section chapters 8 and 9 of Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, and moving on then to the Summa Theologia with a few articles, especially from question 1 of the first part, but also question 12 that are relevant to our course, Reason in the Theology of St. Thomas. Chapter 8 and 9 will accomplish commentary in this section. How the human reason is related to the truth of faith is chapter 8. And so, St. Thomas reiterates that we know sensible things first and even last in the human mode of knowing. Human reason takes the origin of its knowledge and he's from sensible things, but he says sensible things retain the image, the trace of God, or likeness to God. The only reason we can do both natural theology and revealed theology is because the effects, namely creation, bear some resemblance to and say something about and give us a clue as to the nature of the cause, God. St. Thomas says it's very imperfect, of course, absolutely inadequate to manifest the substance of God. So nothing in this created world gives us even the slightest hint of the substance of God, although we can say quite a bit about God from these effects. The human reason is related to the knowledge of the truth of faith in such a way that it can gather certain likenesses of it, which are yet not sufficient, so that the truth of the faith may be comprehended as being understood demonstrably or through itself. So, the truths of the faith cannot be comprehended by us, but there are certain likenesses in creation that can help us to grasp the truths of the faith and to refute the challenges to it. I mean, one good example is the fact that the human reason itself, memory, understanding, and will is Trinitarian. This is Augustine's view here. Memory is like the Father, and intellect the Son, the will the Holy Spirit. So the human soul itself is has a Trinitarian form built into it. This would be an example of a likeness to understand God with. He says it's useful for the human reason to exercise itself in such arguments, namely, in this case, arguments to support the faith and to refute the faith, challenges to the faith, as long as they present no presumption to comprehend or to demonstrate. So as long as we know our limits when we're doing theology. Chapter 9, St. Thomas gives us the basic program for the rest of the work. It goes back to chapter 1, that the wise man should be directed towards the twofold truth of divine things and toward the destruction of the errors that are contrary to the truth, with one kind of truth of God transcending reason and one kind natural to our reason. Again, St. Thomas says, for the first kind of truth, that which is accessible to our reason, we should use demonstrative arguments, and that's what he does for the first 3 books of this massive work. For the second kind of divine truth, we can't use such arguments. What we can do is try to convince our adversary by arguments. Which kind? The kind that would answer his arguments against the truth. We could do that because we know that nothing that natural reason teaches us to be the case can be contrary to the faith. So anything that is contrary to the faith is actually contrary to natural reason as well. That can be shown. Okay. The other thing St. Thomas says, in addition to apologetic arguments against the adversaries of the faith, it's also important, he says, for the consolation and training of the faithful. and that's a good reason to do apologetics as well. He says something very interesting towards the end of paragraph 2 here. He says, for the very inadequacy of the arguments, he's talking about the inadequacy of the arguments against our adversaries. In other words, they're not going to be completely persuasive arguments here. There'll be probable ones that are likely, that can help the adversary to see that his views are not necessary. But St. Thomas says we have to be careful. He says, for the very inadequacy of the arguments would rather strengthen them in their error, since they would imagine that our acceptance of the truth of faith was based on such weak arguments. So if we're giving likely, probable arguments for the truths of the faith, which are arguments maybe that in another place St. Thomas calls a preambula fide, arguments that about the world that natural reason knows, which can support the truths of the faith, they are not demonstrative, they're dialectical, they're probable. If someone were to think that such arguments were indicative of the truths of the faith, in other words, there's a function of the goodness and persuasiveness and cogency of these arguments with the certitude of faith, one might be scandalized. Say, well, look, these arguments aren't that great, so that maybe the truths of the faith aren't that known either. But, of course, the truths of the faith are not known through these arguments. They're known by the divine virtue, infused virtue of faith, in obedience to authority, namely the witnesses of the apostles and the church. Again, these arguments are helpful for those, in a sense, who already have the faith. Okay. So St. Thomas gives us the plan of the Summa Contra Gentiles, but we're only reading a small section of it, so we don't have to talk about the plan. Well, I hope these words, interpretation, and commentary of the text was helpful to you. The next section, we'll move on to question 1 of the Summa Theologia on sacred doctrine, Doctrina Sacra.